But for me, and the way that I approached it, it was really about how to ask questions, and maybe how to ask the right questions, or at least to be open to questions as a general rule. And for me, that's exactly what graphic design is.
Hello, hi everyone, this is Mario, and welcome to a new episode of Design Interview 10 Questions, where we interview designers around the world to talk about design while everything is stopping. My guest today is Erik Brandt, who is a graphic designer and educator. He is currently chair of the design department and professor at the Minneapolis College of Art. He's also an AGI member and the curator of one of my favorite projects, Ficciones Typografika, that I have here with me, and which is is a project dedicated to typographic exploration in a public space. But after than this, I want to welcome Erik. It's really nice to have you here, and thanks to support this project and joining this project. So welcome, Erik.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure, a great honor. I'm so happy to be here.
Okay, so if you're ready, I would just remember you that you are totally free to answer whatever you want to all questions.
Sounds fine.
Okay, so here we go. Let's go with the first one. What made you become a designer? Like there was a story or someone who inspired you. So
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I didn't study graphic design when I was an undergraduate student. I studied philosophy, but after, it's kind of a long story because I grew up all over the world, and after I was finished with university, I moved back to Germany, and where I grew up as a child. Then I moved to Japan. And when I was in Japan, I started working at a small magazine that was in the city I was living in, Fukuoka, which is in Kyushu, southern Japan. And it was an English language monthly. And I was drawing a small comic for them. And then they discovered that I could write and I could edit and I could report. And slowly I worked my way to the editor position. And then, of course, I was involved with a lot of really great Japanese designers. And I became really interested in what they were doing, and I was learning the Quark software and Japanese characters, things like that. And after I came back to the States, I continued in graphic design at a newspaper. But then I realized really quickly that I was really not informed at all in what I was doing. And so years before, I had an art teacher who recommended that I study graphic design. And I had no idea what she was talking about at the time. But when this time of my life came, I remembered her words, and I was lucky. I applied to a graduate program, and they accepted me. And then, and this is 96, and then I studied graphic design there for 2 years. And since then, I've been making graphic design and teaching too.
Okay, that's quite interesting actually. Especially because you didn't start studying design.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
what design is for you then? What does
Yeah.
it mean for you? Because you started as a philosopher, I would say, and then you turn into graphic design. So
Yeah.
I think the meaning for you is quite important.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because there's an old saying that when you're growing up as a child, you're probably already discovering what life means to you and what activity would be best to complement that understanding. But as you grow older, you tend to forget these things. And for me, when I finally started studying graphic design, I understood that it was something that I had already done before, and I was always doing it. If I was making art or if I was studying philosophy, graphic design is really about asking questions. And for me, the study of philosophy was that same thing. It was philosophy was a way of course, understanding many great thinkers and their logic and their words, etc. But for me, and the way that I approached it, it was really about how to ask questions, and maybe how to ask the right questions, or at least to be open to questions as a general rule. And for me, that's exactly what graphic design is, because every opportunity you have to create form around an idea or multiple ideas, you have to be able to ask the right questions to start developing form in an appropriate way. And of course, I think that's really complex because there's no program, you know what I mean, that we all follow. And in fact, I think that's what's so wonderful about graphic design, is that we're always able and capable of learning new things and developing new form, and finding temporary answers to questions that will be there forever, I think. So to me, the two traditions are very complementary, actually, and it's really been a great part of my life.
Okay. So when I introduced you to the episode, I mentioned your Ficciones Typografika, the project,
Yeah.
and I think is quite interesting, and maybe you can also say something about it. But what I'm really interested in, what do you think you had created with this project? You know, like in general, what do you create as a designer? But maybe with this project, I think it's quite interesting for people or also to know it.
Yeah, for Ficciones, I really wanted, right from the beginning, and when I was thinking about it, I really wanted what, as a teacher, I've always wanted for my students. I wanted a place where there was freedom for experimentation, but also a place where it was public, so the experimentation wasn't private in the classroom between teacher and student, so that it had an audience, quite literally, in terms of people. But I wanted it to be something that people could embrace as an extension of their practice, not just a rejection, let's say, of professional practice and the worries and concerns that many of us have around there. Oh, sorry, I have to tell my daughter that her friend cannot come over.
No worries.
No, the project wanted to be, in a way, it was an extension of my classroom, in a sense that it was an open proposal, an open problem that anybody could solve. It just had a few limitations in terms of production, one color, basically black, and a couple of different things of paper. But I really wanted it also to be a larger conversation between designers. To some extent, that was already happening, but it became that larger conversation in a different way. It wasn't just Tumblr and people exchanging hearts and likes, etc. It became real objects, real experimentation in that sense. So, for me, it was really a dream come true. So.
Yeah, I think it's nice. Really nice, this project. So I would also ask you. You're welcome. What do you think you create as a designer? Behind this simple, if we can say simple, but beyond the poster, beyond the.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think that as a graphic designer, in the objects that I make, that I really believe in the intelligence of people, and I really believe in people, period. And so in that way, I always felt that graphic design was a way to ask questions of people, but also to provide answers. Now, that doesn't mean, let's say, in a way that's necessarily direct. And that's what I mean by believing in the intelligence of people. To me, I always think that what I'm actually creating is a question mark. What is this? And the question mark is also an invitation that says, what is this? I will go closer. I will pick this up. I will hold it. I will ask, what is this? And how can I interact with it? And I think that's a complementary way of approaching design and approaching an audience, as opposed to a directive that, let's say, that says, this is what it is, and I'm going to manipulate you in some way to make you think it's something different or trick you. I think those kinds of strategies are very common, for example, in the advertising world, which is focused on consumerism and product and money and purchase, etc. Those things can be approached differently as well. I don't mean to dismiss them out of hand, but I think it's fair to say that there's a fair degree of manipulation there that I have a problem with. And I think it's not just graphic designers that think this way. It's many aspects of the culture that are that think that way. So for me, it's really a matter of making a question mark. And my great teacher was who was Japanese as well, Ochi-san Akira. He and I used to talk about graphic design through a different lens, because he loved to go fishing, for example, and he would take me fishing with him. And we were very strange. I'm very tall and thin, and he was very short. And so we made a strange couple on the rivers in Richmond, Virginia. But we used to talk about graphic design that way too. We say, okay, now there's several different kinds of fishing. There's one kind of fishing where you just have something on the hook and maybe a float, and you throw the bait in and you just let it sit, and then you drink your beer and you just wait for the fish to bite, and you don't really care. And the other kind of fishing is, no, I see this fish and I want to catch that fish. Now I have to figure out how to get that fish's attention. So the bait in that way is a question mark. What's that? Now I'm interested in this, and will I take it? And I think graphic design is similar in that way. You can think of the spine of a book that way. It's sitting in many other books. How can I make this small area attractive to an eye, even from, I like to think the corner of the eye, not just directly looking at it, but actually thinking, how can I catch this? And so those strategies, I think, are very interesting to me, and they play on natural, phenomena and the natural skills and abilities of human beings. We are by nature curious. We want to know the world. I had a great teacher once too who said, he liked to say that, it's very comforting to know the names of things, because we go through the world and we're like, what's this? What's this? And when we know, this is this kind of bird, this is this kind of tree, this is this type of leaf, we feel comfort in that. But it's part of our nature too to simply ask questions. So, that's my approach. I like to think that the things that I make try to ask questions of people and permit them a way to approach it that's not arrogant and doesn't direct them, but actually engages their mind, where they might discover something.
Yeah, so I think in this case was more important the process instead of just the final outcome, which is the book that is really nice. But I think the process and how it naturally changed during the process was quite nice. But usually, are you interested in a sort of kind of process in particular when you design a project, or you're like act free every time?
Yeah, for me personally, as as a designer, I suppose the process is similar. I'm very much language based, and so that what follows naturally from language is typography. And I think it's fair to say that my work is generally very typographic in nature. That's my nature. That's who I am. I grew up all over the world, mostly in Germany and Egypt. So I have a strong interest in languages, and so for me, starting on a project always means starting with words and with questions, as I said before, and answers. And this is a simple process that involves a pen and paper, and from there I can start to develop form, and then embrace many different techniques. But Ficciones was a way of extending what I actually do with my students too, which, depending on the level that they're at, I always try to, I was saying before, our tradition, thankfully, in some ways it has many rules that people describe, but I'm always suspicious of that, because I feel like, well, many different countries and many different traditions have their own rules, so to speak. But as a really good student of mine once said, if you have 20 graphic designers and you give them one problem, you're going to get 20 different solutions. And I think that's really great, actually. So what I try to do is to help people, I suppose, in the way that I came to graphic design backwards. I try to help them discover their idiosyncrasy, meaning their individuality, and to have faith and trust in that. Tradition is fine where appropriate, but the world doesn't really need someone to go and study graphic design for 4 years to just embrace tradition. Otherwise, we would be a trade, like a plumber or something. There's one way to set a pipe, there's a correct way, etc. So I think our tradition is much more open. And as a teacher, I've always tried to express the patience for any number of experiments and any number of attempts. And I think Ficciones was really a reflection of that too, that there was no stamp of authority on how it should look or what should be right or what should be wrong, or for that matter, how the word typography was interpreted. Many of the contributors weren't graphic designers. They were artists or poets or painters. And so, that idea too, that typography isn't just setting type, for example, or manipulating type, that it could also be image-based, that it could be reflective of typography, that it could anticipate a typography that was different. So I think all those things are connected for me, both the practice of teaching and the practice of graphic design.
I got the point, and I totally agree with a lot of things you said before. Do you think perfection exists in design? Of course not, but...
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think we all struggle with that. And especially, I think students struggle with that question, because we're, in the design process, we're always saying, well, it could be this, it could be that. Have you thought about this? Is this the right way? Are we sure? And so for a student, and I think even for me, even to this day, that is the hardest thing to know, is like, when is this thing finished? And I think for graphic designers, it's especially confusing too, because in our process, the end usually involves, going to press, for example, and it's all the process is kind of lost in something going through an offset press, right? But yeah, I personally don't think perfection exists, because I don't think I have ever finished something where, even if I felt such a strong feeling about it, where the next day I didn't say, oh, I wish I had tried one more. I could have done this. Maybe this could have been moved just slightly here. But I've talked about this with other people. I have some friends in Italy, the Studio Moot guys, and we had a discussion about this, and they feel very differently. They have a strong sense when something is done, And I really admire that because I think that's an amazing talent. But I don't have this talent to because I'm always questioning everything. Later in life, in my career, I think it's hard to describe, but what I rely most on in terms of understanding whether a project is finished or not is just emotion. Like if I feel really strongly, if I'm feeling really positive, or just that's something that I rely on. And I know that's not helpful to anybody because it's one thing to feel, but you have to challenge those emotions too with questions like, yes, okay, I really like this, but is it the right solution? But yeah, I think that's a long answer to a difficult question.
I can feel a lot your role as educator, as professor, and there is a question about education. But before, I would like to, let's say, introduce the education topic with another question, which is, what do you think about contemporary design?
Hmm. Yeah, well, I think it's a really exciting time to be a graphic designer, except for the time we're in right now, because everything is in question for everybody. But in the last few years, and I've talked about this before with many colleagues all around the world, we live in a time when I have an expression where I like to say to students, like, as graphic designers, we can play with all the toys. And especially now, we have so many toys we can play with that we didn't have before. Even my generation. We didn't have, now you can literally make anything. If you have the time to discover how and navigate the relevant software, relevant processes, etc., everything is possible. My teacher Ochi-san used to tease me. He said, well, in my day, he had to draw a type by hand for Japanese television, and he could draw perfect Univers 55 by hand, 12 point, 14 point, 16 point, perfect, right? So humans are capable of amazing things, but he would tease me. He said, now you can just say to the computer, I want it this size, I want it that size, you can change everything. And he would say, well, maybe that's not such a good thing. But I don't know. I think it's such an exciting time because also I think there is a real global community and a global aesthetic and a global understanding of what graphic design is developing. A few years ago, people were very critical of the Tumblr community. In that they were worried that students were copying, they were doing this, they were doing that. I didn't have that feeling. I thought it was quite exciting that people were experimenting with type again, that they were embracing typography, and I also could see that they were not just copying, but they were talking to each other, and there was a global language developing. Now, okay, one could say that that's a trend and those are dangerous, but I think there was something more happening, and I think it's still happening now, that people can see each other in a way.
Yeah. And another important topic before we start with education that I guess is very important for you personally is about the impact that internet had on design, especially because you talk that you come from another generation, and now you're living in a period where everything is almost changed. So do you think internet had a good impact on design, or it had a bad impact?
Yeah, I'm of the opinion that it had a wonderful impact. I can see the concern that some people have voiced over the years. I can understand that. People think everything is moving too fast, things are changing too quickly. But I don't know. I mean, I think maybe it's for me too, the way I grew up in so many different cultures and being exposed to so many different language and people and cult and tradition. For me, this idea of multiplicity is really attractive, and it also feels natural. I remember when I was living in Japan, for example, the early internet was just starting, and people were experimenting with BBSs. But then very quickly, some larger companies like Apple started social communities, so to speak. I can't remember what there was. It was called eWorld or something, Apple eWorld or something like that. But of course, AOL was there then, and I thought it was really exciting because you could see the potential for the democratic evolution of things, not just design, but everything. So, of course, now we know that there is an evil potential in this as well, of manipulation, right? Mass manipulation, mass influence. But I think, as with anything, careful consideration of these things can ameliorate those issues. But just in terms of graphic design, I mean, I think it's so exciting now. I mean, you and I, if we wanted, we could start a studio together. We could have a friend in Korea who was working with us. Those things are absolutely possible and are being done every day. So the critique that I've heard, and that I imagine you're referring to too, is that yes, but now we are losing the natural voices of certain regions, the idiosyncratic expression of, let's say, Italian design or central Northern American design aesthetics. And I suppose that could be a case too. But, the evolution of humanity is, as we know, is politically, economically, has always been moving toward a global society. So it's about time that we don't need to say, oh, let's erase all the old voices and the old traditions. Not at all. We can preserve those. But there's also nothing wrong in my mind with a global aesthetic or a global conversation that involves, similar tools that celebrates our tradition. And I think that's still happening.
So in the first episode with Matteo Bologna, we talked about education, and one thing that he said was that for him, it's incredible how young guys today are going out of their classes and they are already able to be independent designers. Mm-hmm. So, and you are a teacher, a professor, and of course an educator that I really like mm-hmm. as work. What's your opinion regarding the design education today, especially?
Well, and for me, I think I've always been very honest with my students. Like I'll tell them the story that I told you before. I didn't study graphic design. I mean, and in some ways, even as a graduate student, I didn't have a traditional undergraduate, set of classes starting with this and moving to intermediate, then going here. So I will tell them honestly, like you don't need a graphic design degree to work in graphic design. You need a strong portfolio. Now, on the other hand, it is a competitive field. And I also believe in education for education's sake. I mean, there's a reason I studied philosophy. There's no job that comes at the end of a philosophy degree. Maybe you can go and do a PhD and become a professor. Most of my classmates, they went to law school, for example. So, but I believe in the time that we allow ourselves as people to pursue education, whatever that field might be. So I think it's absolutely 100% worth it to invest in a time and place where you can be in a safe place to fail. You can make can experiment, you can try new things, you can learn new things, but you can also be in a place where, yeah, this didn't quite work out. That's different when you're working professionally, and failure can mean you lose your job, or you don't get a good recommendation from someone, or a client leaves your employment behind, etc. So I still think, though, that there's possible. I tell my students, life is long. I hope for you. Maybe you will start as a graphic designer, but maybe you will finish as a biologist. You never know. I mean, to me, that's what's so great about graphic design. It doesn't mean you're an expert in everything by any stretch of the imagination, but it should mean that you're interested in everything and interested in learning for your whole life. So anything can happen. But I was, to your question too, I was recently asked this, should students just do freelance when they graduate, or should they try to find a studio job? And I actually think you should do both, because any teacher, any honest teacher will tell you, we cannot possibly teach you everything you need to know. As a graphic designer, you're going to learn more. Every single studio has their own process, their own leadership style, the way that they experiment, the way that they arrange things. You will learn from those things. So, I think it's a good strategy as a young designer. Try the field, find a good studio, find an agency, find something just to feel out too. Is this going to sustain me for the rest of my life? And on the side, if you can find that kind of work, then you can also still engage in what you want to do, and a fantasy life, a fantasy graphic design, etc. All those things can still happen. Marcel Duchamp, right? He got a job as a librarian so that he could be free to pursue the kind of painting that he wanted to pursue, right? A librarian, it's a pretty great idea. But I think there's everything to learn. So I think it's fair to say a lot of from a distance people think, Erik is involved in a lot of experimentalism and fantasy fictional work, etc. But in the classroom, there's plenty of like hardcore portfolio driven work that I can help students with, because again, design isn't just one thing, it's many things. So for me, that's what's so, it goes on the question we were talking about earlier, that everything is possible in our field. And that makes it super exciting.
Education, I believe, is not just as a teacher. It's not just to teach something to students and let them know and improve skills as a graphic designer, but as a teacher, as I said, I believe that you try to, with your experience, to teach them what is gonna be later, So
yeah.
the designer role in the future somehow. And so I would go ahead to the next question and ask you, what do you think is going to be the designer in the future, his role?
Yeah, this is such a great question, because it's so, when people ask me my opinion about this kind of thing, I'm very fond of saying that everything is going to be different and everything is going to be exactly the same. And what I mean by that is, I think it's true. Everything will be different. Technology will change. The applications will change. Our way of interacting with people will change. Maybe it won't be books anymore. I hope not. But maybe already we see a move to e-books, etc. So the projections of what we do as graphic designers and form makers might change, but what will always stay the same, I think, will be type and image, and how those two go together. 90% type, 10% image, 90% image, 10% type. All those variations will always be the center of what we do, because even if type is oral in nature and not not written. We already have the freedom, clearly, to work that way too. So to me, it's always going to be about language, and it's always going to be about the pairing of language with form, and what that looks like. We don't know, and we shouldn't know. And that's what's so exciting to me about graphic design, because in theory, each one of us has the power to constantly evolve and change, or also to find a voice and to push that into the future with you and carry it with you. So, a lot of colleagues in graphic design in recent years, all around the world, have started questioning the nature of graphic design to some degree, justifiably. Some people I know have started to really think about the idea of social design and becoming more engaged in community work as opposed to form making. That's fine with me. I question the ability of a graphic designer to abandon, our traditional tools and do something like that, because I think there's a whole nother tradition, the study of sociology, for example, that would be required. But again, why not? We are engaged people. We are question asking people. Maybe we are qualified. But for me personally, I love making things. I have to make things. I have to make these paintings behind me. I have to explore form. I have to explore language. It's in my nature. So that's what I'm going to do. But I have questions too, like anyone. I mean, it's our field can be very ageist. Mostly it's about younger people, and it's about using younger people to do hard work. And older people, sometimes we start forgetting them, and is their voice still appropriate? It's not cool enough. It's not contemporary enough. That's a danger in our field, I think. But this question of how do you grow old as a graphic designer is really interesting to me, and this is my hope, is that I can do this like other people that I look to, like April Greiman or Karl Martens, or many friends all around the world, where I see them continuing to evolve and change and develop as a designer. I think that's really a key skill. On the other side, I've also seen people that said, no, this is the way, these are the rules, and they perpetuate their career that way. And okay, that's amazing if you can do that. I can't do that. But yeah, I think this is a big challenge. I wonder, what we are living through right now, I think will have consequences for years, right? And I ask myself sometimes, because I know for a fact, I'm a teacher, I don't make a lot of money. I'm going to have to work till I'm 70, maybe 75. Can I still be relevant at 75 to an 18-year-old who is studying graphic design for the first time? It's a really tough question. I think I'd like to think I could. But maybe not, I've already been teaching long enough to experience what happens when you reach a certain age, when suddenly the things that you talk about, the jokes that you make, the music that you're listening to disconnects from the younger people. and they look at you funny when you say something, or, and you're like, oh, right, yeah, no, I lost my contact with this generation. So, but that's a design challenge too, and there again, you have a chance for renewal too, and you can say, well, now I need to ask, well, what are you listening to? Why is that relevant to your culture and to your age? And those things can have influence, I think, too. But yeah, it's a tough question, a tough challenge.
Yeah, connecting with what you just briefly said about what we are living now. I would like to ask you, what do you think the design world can do for this moment? Because like 1 month ago, we would never expect a situation like this, and unfortunately now we are facing this global pandemic. That is also the reason why I started this project. So I think maybe would be interesting for audience to know, what do you think we can do as a designer?
Yeah, I think it's related to the last question because, I see these pressures now, for example, at my own school, where the idea of design is being challenged in the sense that, let's say, this idea like, well, you as a graphic designer, and maybe I'm guilty of this, you're just playing with your circles and squares and triangles, and that really doesn't help anybody. And so we should change design to be about community, about helping people. And I can see the attractiveness of that. But I believe strongly that graphic design and form making in general, artists, painters, anybody who is involved in the pursuit of making things both for themselves and other people is already part of a better society. I think you don't have to say to yourself, I just make websites, so I'm really not helping the world. I don't think that's true. If you are making things for the right reasons, you are already part of a good world. If you're making books for people to read, you are part of a good world, So I think graphic designers have to keep doing what they're doing. Now, on the other hand, if you are involved in making work for companies or people that take advantage of the world or abuse the world or are damaging the world, then you have an ethical question on your hand, right? But each of us has the power to remove ourselves from situations like that. But I worry about the abandonment of traditional graphic design education in place of, let's say, what's loosely called this term of social design, because I believe in the inherent good in making things from letters, making things from nothing, making letters from nothing, putting them together, making something that could be useful, something that could be beautiful. I believe in those things. I think it's a good and healthy pursuit in life, especially if you're worried and believe in other human beings, which I think most of us are. So I don't think we have to suddenly say that now that graphic design is evil. Now, on the other hand, and many of us have talked about this for some years now. A lot of us are involved in the production of a lot of trash. Literal trash. I don't mean bad design. I mean, we make packaging. We make objects that are not recyclable. We shrink wrap our books. Your copy of Ficciones came in plastic, maybe, right? So we have an impact on the world that we have to consider and we have to reconsider. But those are design opportunities too. Okay, so now how do I package books without creating waste? How can I create a package that actually contributes to a recycling cycle, for lack of a better word? So if we're conscious of those things, I think we do good. If we're not, then like anybody else, any other field, we may be creating trouble and bad things. But I would hate, and I see these conversations very close to me now within my school, for example, and I know many of my colleagues agree with me. No, there is still value in pursuing a life dedicated to form making and exploring form, and that can be a contribution to the world. So I hope that's true.
Well, thank you for your answers, Erik. Has been really, really, really nice to have you here today.
Yeah.
And still thank you for the support to the project.
Yeah. Well, and let me thank you too, because when I got your message about what you were trying to do with this project, I was really moved, because I think, in response to your last question, what we're facing now as a global community is something that no generation has faced except for the various plagues in human history. And I don't mean to make light of that, but what projects like yours and I think other people are trying to do in gathering a global community is so beautiful, and it's really meaningful. And in our individual isolation that we're all going to be experiencing now for many months, I think it's especially important that that people like you are doing this and that people engage with these things, because we can still have each other in that way, and we can still have hope for the future, which I do have hope. But like everybody, I'm really worried. So I have to say, 1,000 thanks to you for this chance, and I thank you and your audience too. I hope there's something that made this time worthwhile for you, and thank you so much.